So I just have a question.
Mr. Zlotnick for a question.
Thanks. You added some new language. It was the fishing game definition or something. Just want to confirm that that applies to striped bass. I mean, we don't know this rapid reproduction and stuff like that. We weren't sure what that meant. That's all.
Why don't we deal with that when we get to the definitions?
Well, the reason
Mr.
Chairman, the reason
stop. If there's a motion, Mr. Johnson, that you would make, Mr. Johnson would move it. It would be the instruction to at least provide clarification to Mr. Zlotnick on the question of striped bass as it relates to the standard after the meeting can be in writing, and then we'll deal with it in May if we have to on the whole thing. Okay? All right. Any further questions, members? Okay, starting with Mr. Johnston.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Tully, aye.
Okay, vote of 4-0, one abstention. Ms. Gray can add on to that item, and maybe, ladies, maybe you would be good enough to yell at me when Ms. Gray gets back so we can give her the opportunity to add on. Okay, members, if you would go down on page 8, please. Delta's Place Policy 1, new urban development wisely. Mr. Ray.
Yeah, again, these are, we think, technical clarifications in most part. I'll bring one other detail to your attention in a moment. But this arrived from a request that we clarify two things. One, people said, well, what do you mean urban development? Remember, this was the idea that urban development would need to be located in the cities or their spheres of influence or in the urbanized areas of the unincorporated communities in Contra Costa and San Joaquin County, or else in the unincorporated communities in the Delta. And we said that's where the urban development should be, so the rural areas could be protected for agricultural, natural resource, visitor serving uses. And folks said, what do you mean urban development? We thought we had an easy solution. Initially, we referred to the definition that was in the Delta Protection Commission's rules for defining urban development. That didn't work for us very well. We looked at other definitions in the government code, and that didn't work very well. So then, what we also we're looking at related questions, and actually one of them came up this morning from the city of Stockton. Well, we've got a general plan that counts on us having a lot of development in the urban areas of Stockton. You're not going to interfere with that, are you? And we realized there was an opportunity to respond to both questions at the same time. So what we've done is said new residential, commercial, and industrial development, new uses like that, they have to be located within these urban areas, the cities, their spheres of influence, these unincorporated urban areas that are in Contra Costa and Contra Costa County and San Joaquin County, or in the unincorporated Delta villages that are in the primary zone. Or, notwithstanding that limitation, if you've got a use that's consistent with the existing general plan, it's okay. And that helps us get at the question of when people say, hey, I want to put a house on my farm. You mean I can't have a farmhouse? No, because your general plan is going to describe that as, a use that would be allowed within the agricultural designation of the area. And so we think it actually provides clarity that reassures folks we're not trying to interfere with existing general plans, but that new uses, we have new urban, new commercial, recreational, visitor serving uses beyond what's proposed in the current general plans need to be located in cities or their spheres of influence. And of course, this also doesn't apply to special commercial uses that need to go in rural areas like visitor serving commercial uses. We recognize those activities often need, like marinas and whatnot, need to be outside of the urban areas, as well as facilities for processing local crops or that provide essential services to farms, which also would have a reason to be outside those urban areas. And so those are the changes we're proposing as regards to the technical changes in the policy. And so if there's questions about those, I could hope to address those, and then we'll get to how we're dealing with some mapping changes that we wanted to make as well.
Okay. Members on DPP1, questions? Mr. Johnson, did you have a question?
Actually, maybe, Don, you could report on how this is consistent with your resource management plan and Delta Protection Commission policy.
I believe that it's in line with that, and that the only exceptions are the ones on the maps that, and I think Dan is going to talk about those in a moment. There's a couple of small areas within the actually within Sacramento County, doesn't affect the other areas within the resource management plan, I don't believe. And there were just some very small areas. Some of that may be dealt with, though, in that addition of B under the staff recommendation that Dan just referenced, that if it's consistent with the general plan, and I think the only question there may be whether that's as it relates to resource management plan, because our general plans have to be consistent with that, Pat, as you well know, and I believe they all are. So I think that lines up there. And if it's a permissive use or if there's discretion, because some of those zones allow for certain things, but there's still a subsequent discretionary action. It doesn't require a major discretionary action necessarily, but a use permit or something like that, but it's still provided for in those zones. Because that's the only question, because otherwise I do think it lines up, with the exception that I think our maps will differ just a little bit from what the DPC adopted for the town of Cortland and Walnut Grove, I believe. If I'm not mistaken, I think Hood was already dealt, or you're dealing with Hood, and that was in our map. Yeah. So, is that correct, Dan?
Yeah, and there's a variation at Lock too.
Oh, excuse me, at Lock, yeah.
Yeah, Lock.
There's that area between the cross channel and the town of Lock and the town of Walnut Grove. That area, there's an area in there where there's a tower, but that actually had a commercial recreational designation there for. It was actually approved at one time for a use permit to have a campground and some related facilities. I think that was an area of departure for. And I don't know how it's treated in the resource management plan. Very honestly.
So this doesn't use the term primary, secondary zone.
That's right. These are rules that would apply whether you're in the primary or the secondary zone. So these are.
But you single out the communities that are designated in the primary zone in the DPC's maps, right? And so when you say notwithstanding new residential, commercial, industrial is permitted, if they're designated in the general plan upon the effective date of the Delta plan, right?
Correct.
So in that, is it consistent then with what happens in the secondary zone now, which is a number of cities do have spheres of influence or
within
have
those
incorporated those?
Within those spheres of influence, the uses that would be allowed under this regulation would be those that are consistent with their general plans, or they could be new residential, commercial, industrial uses that are designated for those uses in those plans. Am I right? If I got that right, I'm probably muddled this. You go ahead and explain it. It's smarter than I am. Why don't you get a microphone?
Ms. Davenport, grab a microphone.
Sorry, I was just checking whether
I don't know if all of you have met Jessica Davenport, who's a senior planner with us. We're grateful to steal her from BCDC, and she's brought us a wealth of experience, both as a planner and a biologist.
Sorry, what was the question?
Well, when you erase the distinction between primary and secondary zone, which you seem to have done, what does it mean? It seems to describe whatever the general plan is when this goes into effect, which could be in September, right?
Well, this was set for the date of the Delta Plan's adoption,
Yeah.
so that would be May.
So it'd be May.
Yeah.
So it'd be May. So all the 5 counties currently have incorporated the resource management plan provisions. And then the other limitations are really only the limit. I'm not sure what they are. They're the what we used to call the legacy communities, but Mike Machado says we can't call them that anymore, so we won't. Those towns are limited to,
What do we call them
their boundaries, I guess, right? And then outside of that,
now?
could you have a residential community in which the building site on all the farms were transferred and aggregated into a rural residential subdivision in the primary zone under this policy?
Well, of course, we've got another policy about that too, but it would depend on, I think, initially the general plan that's in place in the county today, or when this plan is adopted. So I think my county, Yolo County, my understanding is the general plan does include a transfer development program, which I believe actually, if I think about our service on the DPC, the Natural Resource Land Use Management Plan also authorizes that as a possibility. I think from conversations with Sacramento County, their general plan doesn't authorize that kind of transfer development. My recollection from our discussions at the time that DPC considered this is that Solano County had contemplated it, but hadn't pursued that kind of an option. So I think it varies from locality to locality.
Okay, well, I don't want to hold up. I just want to ruminate between now and May, because the policy seems somewhat unmoored. I don't know what it's quite tied to, except on the date that we do the plan, then what matches up with the local plans is what's in effect, which suggests to me that in 5 years when this is revised, then there'll be the argument that it ought to match up to whatever the plans are then.
I think it would be worth our while as we...
And with no primary zone, it starts to... I mean, I know that's in the statute, but it starts to blur the line as to what's permissible and what isn't. And then if you can aggregate building site rights to other areas, tomorrow we're going to still have broad areas of open delta, but we didn't have any pressure or controversy for a long time because there was so many spheres of influence that were permitted in 1992. But by the time you got to 15 years out, it changed, and it could change in 10 years. So I'd just like to think about whether here or somewhere else we've articulated what's the land use policy that applies, consistent with the Delta Protection Commission. And even though, they wrestle with it and don't always agree with us or even with me or whatever, I at least think it's grounded, and I'm a little concerned ours may not be.
We should review with you the narrative and the purpose statements, that go with these sections, the purpose and needs sections in the plan, as well as the purpose statement in the rules. Because, the fundamental origin of this policy was the Delta Protection Commission's recommendation about the importance of protecting agriculture. That's the purpose of this policy. It's to protect rural lands for agriculture, and also because we know there are good locations for visitor-serving uses and for natural resources uses. Let's do that by locating these other more urban activities inside towns and areas that are already planned for their use. When we review the land use maps for both the primary and the secondary zones within the Delta, the rural areas outside the spheres of influence are planned for agriculture. There's maybe a little spot zoning in those locations.
I don't want to take any longer.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe just offline, Don, and if he would, and you and I, whoever else is working on this, could just walk through it.
Deal.
Good.
Okay, further comments, questions? We had no one who wished to testify on this. Move it with reservations. Moved Mr. Johnston, second. Mr. Fiorini, or Mr. Natoli, I'm sorry, excuse me.
And then we will meet with staff. And again, if need be, have Mike Michelle join us from the committee.
If you're still concerned, I'm concerned. Okay, starting with Mr. Johnston, call the roll.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Natoli, aye.
Okay, 401 abstention. Thank you very much on DPP 1. DPP 2, members on page 9. Page 9.
Are there any questions about the maps that are associated with these word change in verbiage?
Are there questions?
Yeah, from council members?
I mean, other than the ones we talked about, we can't read them, can't understand them. Other than that,
He meant the land use maps, I
Land
think.
use maps.
Yeah. Again, I think you addressed...
if you're going to meet with Mr. Johnston and Mr. Natoli to talk about that last policy, why don't you add checking the maps once again?
Okay, that's fine.
Please. Okay. All right. Policy number, Delta's Place Policy 2, respect local land use when siting water or flood facilities or restoring habitat.
Yeah, this was a simple clarification proposed in response to questions from state agencies and others who asked when we said in this policy that these water and ecosystem restoration facilities or infrastructure should be cited to avoid or reduce conflicts with existing or planned uses. What did we mean? You know, if Uncle Bob always wanted to put a marina on the property, do they have to avoid that conflict with that, or was it really just what the use was that was anticipated in the county general plan? So we had always intended that the use that they were trying to be attentive to was either the existing use or that was portrayed in the city or county general plan. So we just revised the text of the regulation to make that more clear.
Okay. Any other questions? I don't believe we have we don't have anyone that has requested opportunity to speak on this issue. Questions by members of the council? Don? No. Okay.
I would move.
Pardon?
I prepared
Mr. Natoli moves. Second, Mr. Johnston on Delta's Place Policy number 2, page 9. Starting with Mr. Johnston, call the roll, please. We'll come back to you at the end of this, but page 9, Delta Policy number, Delta Plan P2, pretty minor changes, no comment from the public on this issue. Okay, Ms. Gray's aye. One abstention.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Natoli, aye.
Okay, we've got 5-0 with one abstention. At the bottom of page 9, risk reduction policy number 1, priority of state investment in Delta levies and reductions. Dan, this is probably the most obvious where we've removed the language that was included to really define with clarity the council's projection of what we wanted to study in the state investment strategy, and it's quite long. Mr. Nordhoff is not here, and I know he takes some degree of pride in the details of what you are proposing to delete from the policy. Okay. My suggestion to you is, and I think what you're planning anyway, is to move this language into the Delta plan, not as a regulation. I think you ought to consider the possibility of returning to us maybe at the April meeting, maybe at the March meeting, I don't really know when, and incorporate this stuff into a motion, really a guidance to staff motion on doing what we're statutorily required to do, and we know we're going to do it, and we've said we got to complete it by 2015, but without this kind of a format and structure, even if you come back with some policies and changes, you're going to flail around a bit doing it. And for me, this would be a helpful activity, even if it's not, and it should not be a regulation itself. And I think that's probably more defensible for Mr. Nordhoff if he raises the issue too.
Are there other questions?
No.
Mr. Chair?
Don?
Yeah, if I could. I just want to alert certainly council staff to a situation that's occurred very recently, and we're still trying to work through it, but it kind of goes to levy prioritization, but also the investment, and it speaks to the minimum standard relative to particularly meeting the 8499 height in levy structural requirements, but the fact that only calls for a 16-foot crown road. And as we're looking at some activity throughout the Delta that I would just, for example, that may be fine for a service road, but if that is the road section That's to serve the general public, and a number of the values are cited here, both life safety as well as obviously the recreational values and so forth. That, from a standpoint of a minimum standard, is not a minimum standard county facility, and I don't think it'd be a minimum standard city facility certainly for two-way traffic and so forth. And what we've gotten into, I wanted to alert staff to this, is that the whole economic argument, the RD says, well, we don't have the money for it. State says we're not paying more than just a minimum standard to raise the levy. That's flood protection is the primary role here, and I'm being very general. County has stepped up and said, well, we'll participate to a point, but we're not, to build another 4 foot of levy and all the costs that are coming upon that. We maintain the road on top of it by agreement. But what it's doing is that you prioritize levies, and it's kind of a narrow focus. And I wanted to point it out because it's not just a small section levy. It's a fairly lengthy section, and it puts, to some of the comments we heard earlier today by Melinda on behalf of the agency she represents and others, we're getting into kind of a catch-22, and you prioritize, and it's great to protect the life and property. But if you begin to choke down the ability for the communities and folks that are served by those roads, and whether it's mail service or garbage service or recreational traffic, day-to-day activities, a 16-foot section is just not, for lengths along the rivers and sloughs and so forth, is not sufficient, and I think puts a lot of liability exposure on the transportation side of it. As we're talking about these, it's kind of embedded in here, but it really isn't, and it's only come to my attention recently, and it's one of those things where we're on a catch-22, you got a window to do the construction, and it's going to be an inadequate section, and we're going to get into this conflict with local agencies about who's going to maintain the road. If there's even going to be a road there, it's going to serve the public any longer, which it currently does. And so I raise it because it becomes not only an economic factor, but it becomes a safety factor, and it's fine for service road for levee inspections and doing the things with that, but 16-foot crown sections may meet the FEMA and Corps standards. Doesn't meet the standards, though, for a safe, passable road for two-way traffic. And we're not talking about major highways here. 16 is very narrow with no shoulders, water on one side, maybe a steep slope on the other side. And so I raise it because it's part of the fabric of what we're doing and trying to accomplish certain goals here. It may be strangling other activities, and certainly the quality of life issue and the ability even to move farm equipment in some cases. So I raise that down. It's only been real recent. We're trying to work through it, but it becomes an economic one. Who's going to pay that extra share to get the road crown in there?
Yeah. No, I appreciate the heads up. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks.
Good. Thank you very much. All right. Any further council questions on RRP1, risk reduction policy 1? Okay. We have no request to speak on this item. Is there a motion to adopt? Ms. Gray?
So moved.
Ms. Gray moves. Mr. Fiorini? Seconds. Starting with Ms. Gray, if you would please cast votes.
Gray, aye.
Gray, aye. Abstain.
Fiorini, aye.
Eisenberg, aye.
Totally aye.
Okay, 401 abstention. Ms. Gray, there were 3 items that you missed, and you indicated you would like to record a vote. Could you tell us the item and then how you would wish to be recorded?
Yes, and I have read all the changes in
Right.
each item. It's ERP3.
ERP3.
My vote is yes.
Okay. Wait a minute. Let's let the ladies make sure they record it. ERP3, yes. Okay. Next item, please.
ERP4.
ERP number 4.
Yes.
Yes.
DPP1.
Delta's Place P1.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Gray. All right, members. Let's go up to policy number. This is page 12. Policy RRP2. RRP2.
Yes. This is a policy that controls the amount of flood protection that's required, and we have major subdivisions, but subdivisions with more than 5 parcels. Subdivisions filed under the State Subdivision Map Act, 5 or more parcels in the rural parts of the Delta. This is a remnant of a much more complex policy that was in earlier visions of the Delta Plan that specified the level of flood protection that was required for a whole variety of land uses. And little by little, it's been deconstructed to retain simply a standard for rural residential development, major rural residential development. And the feeling has always been that the rural delta is an area of extraordinary flood hazard, unusual in part because much of it is below sea level, and so the hazard is very great, and also because in many cases people would need to evacuate across large areas that are also below sea level, so the evacuation is very difficult. So the council has sought to have a higher level of flood protection for those areas that might be typical in other parts of the Central Valley, and so the policy that had been in the Delta Plan proposed that flood protection should be provided to a minimum of a 200-year level of flood protection. That would be a flood that have a 0.5% chance of occurring in any given year. But typically, areas were required to have a 100-year level of flood protection if they're outside major cities in California's valley. And they could accomplish that either with levees or flood proofing. We heard from a variety of local governments especially that said, we don't know what the 200-year level of flood protection would be. We don't know what a 200-year flood would be in the rural part of the Delta, because while the state is going to provide local governments information about what that would mean for the urban areas, they won't provide it for the rural areas. And so we looked at this and realized that there would be another approach for pursuing it that would be responsive to the purposes that the council had identified, and that was actually advice that we got from the Ocean Protection Commission, which is dealing with the issue of sea level rise and a changing climate. And I think you've all received the letter that we got today.
It was handed
Ocean
out
Protection
this morning
Commission.
on
Yeah.
our table.
And this is an alternate approach to making sure we've got adequate, safe flood protection in the rural areas of the Delta. But it does it in a different way. It says, okay, we know what the 100-year flood would be. The Federal Emergency Management Agency does calculate that together with DWR as part of the National Flood Insurance Program. And typically what you would need to do is provide that the base floor of your structure would be flood-proofed to a foot above that elevation, so that if there was a flood, the flood waters could move around your structure, and your home and your property, and perhaps you yourself would still be safe on this elevated structure. And obviously that's a good idea for rural areas, but if the sea is going to rise, that's really not going to provide protection for a real long period. With seas rising 55 inches, force the forecast by the end of the century. And so a suggested alternative that we're proposing would be that in lieu of specifying the 200-year flood level of flood protection, which probably won't be information available for the local governments, that we would suggest that the flood proofing they would provide would be 55 inches on top of the elevations that would be required to meet the FEMA flood elevation. That would be easily measured because you would just have to go up to 55 inches. And of course, if you were an area that was already above sea level, some if you were 24 inches above sea level, so that you wouldn't be affected by the full 55 inches, you could just subtract your current elevation above sea level from the forecast rise. And so we think that's a proposal that makes a lot of sense. It wouldn't make sense to build levees to that elevation because we have no idea what the impacts of levees raised to that height would be. But in terms of flood proofing or rural residential structures that, might be created as a result of kind of the sorts of subdivisions that Councilman Johnson was talking about, I think this would be a reasonable level of protection. And you'll see the advice of the Ocean Protection Commission that we pursue it.
Don, Mr. Antoli.
Well, first I would just say I appreciate the work staff's done, and I know we had a briefing a couple of weeks ago, and they shared they were at least considering it at that time, and I think that it's a recognition of the aspects of not knowing what the 200-year flood protection may be, and certainly of levees of those sorts, and the practicality that many areas in Delta, that's really not something that's achievable or practically could be achieved anyway. But when I started 55 inches and sea level rise, that's a 90-year, and I guess you anticipate the development would be there for a long time, if not much more than 90 years. And we're talking about, I guess, a modest level. I mean, there probably won't be too many occurrences of this, but you could have someone that could trigger this. But when I think about this, because even levels that are above sea level now would have to add the additional footage to structures or to pads or whatever in order to meet this. And I guess the question, Mr. Chair, for me, though, is that, and I think Dan shares in the briefing, apparently some areas along the coast are now applying this, but there are a lot of obstacles, and rightfully so, in some cases where we don't want development. I mean, it's not zoned for it, and it's not, in your very lower elevations, but you got 4.5 feet basically to everything on top of FEMA, and you could have, some of those areas are deeper floodplains. You may have town of Cortland base elevation right now is, because of the remapping, is 20 foot or 18 feet, and you add the foot on, you're right at 20 feet. So then your starting point is 25 foot. Now that may reflect obviously the existing floodplain and what may occur from sea level rise, but this becomes very precedential in my view, as far as, and maybe that's the intent of the plan, that you start building in, measuring what's going to happen at the Golden Gate and applying it, 80 miles inland to, areas that are well upstream, and some of those that had 100-year protection by virtue of remapping that occurred only in the last few months now no longer have it, and so, now you've got this criteria that is, stacked on top of it. I guess what I would ask, and because it's kind of unknown, I think maybe an alternative approach would be versus the levees and or the 55 inches is that there must be some idea what the 200-year would be relative to the elevation of either the pad or the structure. I may not know what the exact amount, but you've already built a foot in there on the 100-year as part of the FEMA standard. And I guess I'm wondering, Dan, has there been any conversation with your water resources engineers, with your local jurisdictions about that?
Well, in fact, that was trying to respond to concerns that we heard articulated by Sacramento County and other Delta counties that they didn't know what the 200-year
no, we don't, because that has been said. But it's not 55 inches, I don't think. I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's 55 inches.
No. It wouldn't be a lot.
No, that's what again, I don't know. I've heard say that it's marginal, but I don't know if it's this or this, but and that might be more palatable, I guess, because you get a higher level of safety, but you're not. I think 55 inches is a bit extreme, I guess.
Yeah, and this wouldn't be a standard, just to clarify, that would apply to the FEMA rules that apply to existing structures. It wouldn't be a standard that would apply to construction of a new single-family home on an existing lot. Wouldn't apply if a rural landowner wanted to split a parcel in half through a parcel map division, just do 2 parcels, they put a home on it for their kid. Wouldn't apply to a grower who wanted to divide a parcel at an ag parcel size, maybe 2 or 3 lots, so he could mortgage them separately and raise capital for farm improvements. Would only apply to major rural residential subdivisions, 5 or more lots. And I think you're right, Supervisor Natoli, these are properties that are going to be there for a long time. And it's an attempt on our part to do what the Delta Plan tells us to do, look down the road and have a long-term plan that can anticipate climate change, among other things.
I want to weigh in.